Welcome to Bandsplainer, the podcast where we explain bands. I'm your host, Olivia Ladd, a music journalist in Nashville, Tennessee. The premise of this podcast is I find a friend, musician, or other journalist in the Nashville music scene, and we discuss the history, discography, art, and influences surrounding our favorite cult bands. Bandsplainer is part of the We Own This Town network of podcasts based in Nashville. You can find more information at weownthistown.net. Bandsplainer is available for streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. To keep up with the latest, follow Bandsplainer on Twitter at Bandsplainer. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Bandsplainer, the podcast where we explain bands. And today we are recording the first episode of season 2 of Bandsplainer. Very exciting. And we have our guest, Olivia Jean, and we are going to talk about the Slits, which is a great band. Super excited to dig into. So you can go ahead and introduce yourself and what you do as a artist, person, all of those things.
I'm Olivia Jean. I was in a band called the Black Bells, and now I do solo stuff, and I just put out my second solo album on Third Man Records.
Yeah, and it's a great album called Night Owl that you should definitely check out. And you just got back from tour, right? How did that go?
Yeah, I opened up for the Raconteurs, and that was great. It was, it's, overwhelming to play in front of those size crowds, but it was great.
Nice. Yeah, I caught you at a Saturday night Ryman show, so that was very great. That was awesome to see.
Kind of funny playing my type of music in the Ryman.
I know. I loved it, though. I was like, this is great. It feels like it's not supposed to be happening, but, like, in a good way. Like, very punk. Yeah, it was cool. Yeah, so the Slits, if you're not familiar, just a quick synopsis, is they are a all-women UK punk band, and they're kind of considered pioneers or, like, prototype musicians of the proto-punk era. They really like set a standard for a lot of bands, much like someone like maybe the Velvet Underground. They were not necessarily critically acclaimed or sold a ton of records up front when they were around, which was also a very, very short time period, which we'll get into. But they've kind of influenced a ton of bands after, and you see that influence in everything from Riot Girl to like ska punk today, so it's like a very big range. I think they're pretty underrated for what they did and kind of how lasting their influence has been. The like lineup of the Slits is considered to be Ari Up or Arian Forster, I think is the correct way to say her name, Viv Albertine on guitar, Tessa Pollitt on bass, and Palmolive on drums. And there are some different member switches, which we'll get into as we go through time, but that's considered the classic lineup. When they put out the first album, that's who was on it, or when they played their first shows, that's who was playing. So they formed in kind of early 1976. Palmolive Paloma Romero was a drummer, and she wanted to start a band. She was dating Drew Strummer, and so apparently it started when she went to a Patti Smith concert, and Ari was there with her mom, like throwing a fit, and Ari was 14. And so she just saw this girl in the crowd and was like, wow, she like has what it takes to be a front woman. Like, she doesn't care what anyone thinks. So she walked up to her and was like, do you want to start a band? So they did. And so they originally also had Kate Chorus on guitar and Susie Gutsy on bass before the other members joined. And Susie Gutsy kind of moved out pretty soon, and Tessa Pollitt joined the band right after that. During that time, also, before Viv joined the band, she was dating Mick Jones of The Clash, which kind of sets the scene also. It's like late 70s UK punk. Punk is this brand new thing. You have bands like The Clash and Buzzcocks and Sex Pistols and all of that sort of forming. And Viv wanted to play in a band, so she met Sid Vicious and was like, we should start a band. And they were in Joe Strummer's basement all summer of 1976 in the band Flowers of Romance, which Palmolive also joined. So they were sort of friends or whatever, but Sid Vicious sort of kicked her out of the band, even though it was her own band, and then did his thing. Anyway, so we come to 1977, and this is when they kind of really solidify things. So they played their first ever gig on March 11, 1977, which is my birthday. That's exciting.
Oh, really? Cool.
And basically, this first show is really important. So, like, yeah, I want to dig in here. So it was headlined. It was on the White Riot tour, the Clash's headlining tour of 1977. And they played with Buzzcocks and Subway Sect, and Prefects were on some of the shows on that tour as well. And so this show was so influential that, like, this show alone inspired a lot of other people to start bands, and it inspired Viv to join the band. So, yeah, we can kind of go into that for a second.
So Viv was in a band called the Castrators? And she was in that band while she saw a Slits show. And she asked the Slits, she said, if you guys need a guitarist, I'm in. And also Viv was in the Flowers of Romance, but Flowers of Romance only lasted 1 year.
Yeah.
So
very short.
So she was involved in other gigs and saw the Slits live and was like, I want to be a part of that. So she approached them and they had her join, and she replaced Kate Chorus. Mm-hmm.
This gig was a big deal because this band in general, there was no precedent to women in punk rock, basically, is that all they had was Patti Smith kind of as an example, and no one else was doing that. So they talk about, I think in the documentary, which is called Here to Be Heard, the story of the Slits, they talk about how the men around them, like Sid Vicious or whatever, could look to all of these people. They had everyone from Elvis to the Beatles or, you know, whatever, and then the people that had started punk, and women just had no, like, representation. And this is very, this is like proto-punk, so it was before it truly existed as a genre, so to say it was being formed, just because of, like, the societal ideals going around in the UK, everywhere at the time, really. It was just sort of a thing where it was the boys' club, as, you know, parts of punk still are, but especially then. So it was cool because this first gig was, like, you know, members of the Raincoats eventually became members of the Raincoats, saw it, and were like, oh, I never thought I could just pick up a guitar. Now I'm gonna do it because someone else did. So that's, like, so cool that with their first ever gig they did that. And there's an emphasis, I think, with a lot of these bands, sort of like Bikini Kill we've talked about and stuff, of they're like, oh, well, we didn't know how to play our instruments, we just picked it up, whatever. And in a way they didn't, and it was a lot different back then to where now it's sort of a career thing, and people are very polished, I think, especially in, like, Nashville. Yeah.
It's hard to find some
raw. Yeah.
I wish there was more punk here.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. But it was cool because that was all they knew to do at the time. So it was just super raw, pure, and, like, they ended up kind of coming up with their own guitar styles and, like, percussion styles and just ways of playing that ended up being, like, super almost revolutionary and inspired all these other
very
people.
Experimental.
Yeah.
Very strange melodies, sometimes clashing melodies that somehow fit together. And also, I think it was Tessa who said in an interview that in the clubs that all of these, you know, bands that started the punk scene in Britain, they would hang out at the Roxy, and the DJ there would play reggae music, because in the beginning of punk, there was no punk. So that also has a big influence on their playing, because they started out loving reggae.
Yeah, that's, like, a really cool point, which we'll totally get into, like, their reggae influence and stuff. But yeah, so Don Letts, who ended up managing the 1977 White Riot tour, before all that, when they were all hanging out in the scene and they were teenagers, he DJ'd, the Roxy. And I love that point they made. Yeah, like, there were no punk records to play at the punk club, so they played reggae records. And a big part of that is, what's interesting about the Slits is all of these sort of white male oriented punk bands kind of told their story, where it was, which isn't a bad thing, but they wrote what they knew, and it was a lot of, like, parental rebellion and this sort of, like, stunted view of sexuality and things like that. And the Slits were maybe the first band, I think, during that time, I don't want to say first, but the band during that time that most sort of incorporated a reflection of what was happening maybe politically and culturally in the UK, because there were a lot of Caribbean and African Caribbean immigrants in the, around the time where there was also sort of a recession, and that's kind of where reggae came out of, like, for what we know reggae to be now, sort of really developed in the UK. And then it goes from everything to like classic reggae to like lovers rock and all that. Anyway, the Slits were in that scene as much as they were the punk scene.
Mm-hmm.
So they were going to clubs where, you know, reggae clubs, and picking up on that and hanging out with reggae musicians. And it's really cool that they kind of jumped on, like, okay, why don't we make punk with this like world music sound so quickly in their career.
And Johnny Rotten in an interview said that another reason they loved reggae is because they, as punks, they could relate to the lyrics of reggae.
Yeah.
You know, because it had to do with, you know, struggles and stuff like that. So they related to the lyrics as well, which is pretty neat. Because you wouldn't imagine the punk scene to be so into reggae at that time, because no bands really incorporated that into their music.
For sure. It was like such a straight sound of like what punk was, partially because it was so new, and it was like, we're just going to play these 4 chords. But yeah, it was really interesting. And that there's something to be said there, because it's like, you can look at crossovers throughout history, like right now, the sort of like hip hop and yeehaw thing going on, but there's a lot of crossovers between like race and class in music that are sort of a solidarity alliance sort of thing. So that's what this was like, reggae is about like class struggles and you know, just like life being hard, and like punk may have began as like maybe these suburban boys talking about whatever, but for the Slits it was them like, okay, we can translate this type of like lyricism or talking about our struggles, but we're going to talk about our struggles as women, sort of in that setting, which is like also a big thematic thing. But yeah, that's like a really cool part of them.
Yeah, they incorporate feminism, I wouldn't say in a hateful way. They incorporated it in like a confident, strong way, because, you know, in a respectable way. And that made the bands around them really appreciate them. And they all knew that the Slits were something special, and they had a big support group. But also in interviews, they say that eventually the bands that were all guys were kind of shifty-eyed towards them.
Yeah.
A little bit. I mean, it's inevitable.
Yeah.
But they did still have that respect. And I think it's because they used their feminism as a confidence thing, not as a hate thing.
Yeah, they definitely used it as like people, they kind of went about this, which they talk about in different interviews, of not like using punk as like anger or hatred. It was more like, this is a place where we get to just do whatever we want. And like, that takes a lot of guts, you know, like in 1976 to just like literally do whatever you want. The way they dressed and cut their hair and like the things they sang about were really, really new at the time. And they talk about how, you know, eventually labels can maybe hold someone back, but, you know, nowadays I never want to go about like as a writer like being like, oh, this is like a feminist band just because there's women in it. But at this time it was sort of inherently feminist that they were women in a band talking about what they were talking about, like everything from assault to like societal standards to whatever. That was brand new. That was really cool. And it even took so many years for that to stop being like a revolutionary thing, which is the crazy part. Like until the 90s that wasn't normalized at all.
Yeah, I think they really set the precedent for, you know, feminism in music, and, you know, not being afraid to be a little bit harsh. And they really did, I think, influence the Riot Girl genre. I think that they were the pioneers in kind of that incorporating political female issues into music.
Yeah.
So,
which is cool because, yeah, it's like you look at like the Clash, to me is one of my favorite like political bands. Like they write political music that isn't like some weird protest song that doesn't actually sound good. You know, it's like good music, good message. So they kind of, it was like the same thing, but they like they personalized that. And I think for a lot of women personalized it. And it is cool that they were the precedent for all these later bands, but also just the bands in the scene of like, and you have to remember they were like, the front woman was 14, 15, and they were all, like only a few years older, 17, 18. And like Susie and the Banshees, X-Ray Specs, Chrissy Hynde, the Raincoats, all of those bands kind of happened because of what they were doing, or like around the same time. But like the Slits were the first one, which is so cool.
More people should definitely know about the Slits if they're into punk rock music. I do think that they need more attention. And very influential. And I got my first Slits record when I was like a preteen.
Oh yeah, I was
and it really
ask,
influenced me.
What was your first like experience listening to the Slits?
I was probably 12 or 13 when I got their album.
The first one?
Cut.
Yeah.
Nice. And I loved it. I listened to it on repeat, and I still do. It doesn't get old.
Oh no, it actually, it's one of those albums where like, I think especially kind of digging in for research for this, I was like re-listening to it, and I was like, oh, I never heard that part, or like this, because it's such an interesting, like, it's an avant-garde punk album, like, it's such an interesting, like, artifact of its time or whatever. Yeah, I think the first time I heard them was probably when I was getting into a lot of other proto-punk, but it like felt different. I was like, oh wow, this is wild that this is a thing.
At first I was a little bit like, I would only listen to it once in a while, but then I really like got into it.
Yeah, I think it can, their music maybe could like throw people off in a way, and but I think that was like the shock factor was their thing. Like even the way they looked, especially in the earlier days. There was one scene in the documentary where they were like having band practice, where passing around like a teasing comb.
I saw that and I loved it. I'm like, you might be punk, but your hair still has to look
exactly. Good. I was like, that's so great that they like put so much effort into all of that. So 1977 they do the Clash tour and get a lot of like music press from like zines to like big UK things, because people just couldn't figure out what they were doing, and so they were like, cool, we're gonna keep doing it.
Before their first gig, before they had ever played live, they were featured in a magazine. They had an article written about them before they even played live.
Wow.
Because of them being females in the punk scene. It was like, pretty rare.
Yeah, because it was like a lot of where, like, obviously, but a lot of people were like, if you were a woman in the scene, you had to be someone's girlfriend, or you had to be whatever, and they were like, no, like, we're just starting this band, and like, it was like people within the scene looked at it as this like, oh wow, that's different, like, that's, what are they doing, that's crazy.
Yeah, so they are, even before they played live or recorded their first album, they were already shocking people.
That's amazing. I love that. They do that tour, and then 1978 they signed to Island Records, so obviously they've gotten quite a bit of people like rallying around them, and it's interesting that they signed to Island Records, and I think it sort of helped shape kind of who they became as a band, for sure, because Island Records had everyone from Bob Marley to like Roxy Music signed to them. So this is like a British Jamaican label, which now I think operates under Warner, and they kind of do pop stuff, but at the time it was sort of like reggae and experimental art rock, which is like so cool.
Yeah.
But they were given, part of the deal was they were given like full creative control, and so they're sort of still learning how to play their instruments, but they wanted like Ari, especially when they were recording Cut, their first record, which we're about to get into, wanted to be sort of in the room when every decision was made. And so it's really cool how hands-on they were for not being like musicians, quote unquote.
Yeah, and I think they started playing their instruments 2 years before they recorded their album.
Yeah.
So
that's like crazy.
Yeah.
Cut ended up coming out in 1979, but it was recorded in 78. And to me, it's sort of a perfect punk record. It's considered one of the like biggest, like most important proto-punk records, but I think it's a perfect punk record by the standard of like, it's just over 31 minutes long. All the songs are like one after another. It's just like a great like example of what a punk album should be.
I did not realize it was only 31 minutes long.
No, to be that influential in like half an hour, like that's wild.
Yeah, they definitely, in that album, did set them apart from other punk music. They incorporated world music, experimental music, reggae but it still sounded punk. It still had that simplistic backbone, but they were adding in different influences, which was not done before.
Yeah, it really wasn't. It was such a new thing at the time. And so they knew they wanted to kind of go about incorporating those things. When they were talking to the label, they set them up with Dennis Bovell, who, I hope I'm saying that correct, was like a dub reggae producer in the UK. And so he was a member of Matumbi, that band. So he went in as this really diverse producer and kind of did whatever they wanted to do. And that's where you get that sound from. So that like spring of late 78, spring of 79, they recorded in Ridge Farm in Surrey, which is like a village in West Sussex, England. They recorded the whole thing there, and so Viv and Ari had kind of written most of the songs, I think, between them. Yeah, it's like a really interesting sort of how it came together.
Yeah, and also at that time, when they put out their album, they had let Palm Olive go because she was kind of like questioning like the boundaries of the band.
Yeah.
And they were confused about her intention, I suppose, that she wasn't confident in the direction they were already in. So they replaced Palm Olive with Budgie.
Yeah,
his nickname
who
Budgie.
Later went on to be in Susie and the Banshees. I think his real name, Peter Edward Clark. Budgie is much cooler, I think.
Yeah, so in Cut, it was just Viv, Ariep, and Tessa.
Yeah, so they kind of end up being the integral members of like creating this sound as far as, you know, whatever. But Palmolive she was very influential in the punk scene and kind of helped them get to that point. But yeah, part of that was what the album sounded like and the album cover and a lot of those things. But it is interesting that they were so confident going about this, and we can actually go into like kind of individual songs and stuff. But my favorite thing about it was just kind of like how they recorded was funny, because they said they kind of basically sent out this producer with these 3 girls and their new drummer, teenage girls, and we're just like, okay, like make an album. And so kind of on the point of like them not knowing super well how to play instruments, Viv said she kind of felt like a little insecure because like Dennis and Ari were really strict about what they wanted and in directing it. And so I found a quote about the song Newton, which is a great one on the record, and Viv said, "When I was playing Newton, they kept saying you're not getting it. By the end, I was so furious, I just thrashed at the guitar and made strange noises, and over the intercom, they were like, that was fantastic." So
in Newtown?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
cool.
she was like she said she would like cry every night. Like, I imagine being a teenage girl making this like really important punk record.
Very overwhelming. Yeah, it's
be
very
stressful.
They were probably completely out of their element and not around people that other punk artists who are totally cool being super raw. Totally out of their element. I can get that for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Like it was a process for them. And so I just thought it was funny though that she was like, every night I would go to bed in tears, and then she just got angry and like made a weird noise, and they were like, that's what we want. Like
that's
the
usually
weird
happy
noises.
accidents.
Yeah. Yeah, which I imagine happens a lot in recording, but I love like to hear the story. And there's other things like I'm trying to find the exact song. I think it was also in it's in Newton. Dennis said to do percussion for that one, he was like, the quote is, "I got hold of an ashtray, a spoon, and a box of matches, and that was my percussion, shaking the matches, tapping the ashtray with the spoon, and occasionally striking a match."
Yeah, the match strike. Yeah, I love
you
that.
can hear it, like, which is so cool, because I always listened to that and was like, that's like a utensil. I don't think that's a real drum. That's cool.
Yeah, that is cool. I've used like sandpaper in my songs, and I've used
I love that.
pots and pans. Wow. And actually, I had heard about that technique like before I started going into the studio, so just like influenced by them.
Yeah, and it's
experimenting and such.
This record cut, like a lot of these songs are what people remember the Slits by or whatever. So like a big live one they always played was Shoplifting.
I love that song.
I know, it's so good. It's like about teenage girls shoplifting, which was like very punk at the time. It's still punk. It's
and they
still
did
cool.
a music video for that too that you can watch.
Yeah.
Pretty funny.
Yeah, their music videos are wild. Like, you can find most of the ones they have, I think, for like Shoplifting and Typical Girls are on YouTube, and they're very funny because the way they were all dressed with like the big hair and face paint and like weird outfits, like, you know, and you have that like 70s film look on it. It's very cool.
Yeah, I love that song. I would attempt to sing it, but I will not do that right now.
I'm sure you could do it much better than I can. So yeah, so there's that song is a really good one, and then Typical Girls I think is probably their most like defining song. It was in Pitchfork's like the story of feminist punk in 30 or 33 songs, which has a lot of good stuff on it. And it was, so The Observer made a list of like the 100 greatest British albums, and they got number 58 for Cut, and it also charted at number 30 on the UK charts at the time, which was like kind of a big deal because once again there was no precedent. There wasn't like a separate chart for this sort of music. But Typical Girls, I think, is like the most defining song on this record. And Kurt Cobain actually said that it's like one of his top 50 songs of all time, which I think is like so cool. Like, they just influence so many people that are punk adjacent in so many ways.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. You're full of fun facts.
Glad. And then I think another kind of standout is they did a Marvin Gaye cover of I Heard It Through the Grapevine on their record, and did it totally different than the original. Like, so
very reggae.
Yeah. The phrasing was very sort of, I don't know the word, like reggae phrasing, like sort of intermittent and paced out, and it was very like on a slow beat, and it's a really great song. And I think that was one of the like probably the first song I had heard by them, and I was like, okay, so like it's cool to see a cover because that's like a really concrete way of like comparing a band's sound to like some sort of standard, I guess, in a way. So for them it was like, oh, like I've heard the Marvin Gaye song and now I see what they're doing musically by like listening to this cover, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. I think the song that I mean, if I had to choose a favorite, it would be Love und Romance. Love und Romance. I love that song. Again, like very strange riffs, strange vocal melodies. Yeah, but it all works.
Yeah, together. And that's the cool thing is like it was like, I mean, even to today's standards, just very avant-garde and like weird guitar noises. Like you kind of feel like the Fred Sonic Smith vibes, like sort of thing before that was a thing. Yeah, it's just cool because it is like all these weird layers, and it works. Like it just magically is like, okay, like they knew what they were doing. Like they may have been teenagers that thought they couldn't play instruments, but like they did pretty great. Like,
sometimes that's, you know, when magic happens, when you don't know what you're supposed to be doing, so you just do what you feel. Yeah. And I think that's what they did.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I feel like that's how I go through life. I'm like, well, I don't know how to do this, so because I don't know the rules, I can do whatever I want. Exactly. Like with anything, and that's the best way to be creative,
yeah,
I think.
I bet that was going through their heads.
Yeah,
I'm just betting.
Yeah, yeah, but, I could probably from experience. So it's so cool that that record is so great. It's so great.
Yeah, it's definitely a classic. Definitely something that people should be listening to. Yeah, their second album was Untitled, their Untitled album in 1980, and it was consisted of demos and live performances, and it was quite a contrast from Cut.
Yeah,
because it was a lot more, you know, I guess you could say traditional punk, very simplistic, not a lot of reggae in that album.
It was kind of a reflection of where they started out, which later in 1988 they released a double Peel Sessions, which is like we'll get into later, which is like my favorite thing though when the Peel Session gets released. But yeah, so it was all these demos and stuff, so it was like way before they had polished anything, or when they recorded these they didn't polish them or whatever. So it's like a really interesting sort of retrospective collection of songs that are still really good. Like for raw punk music.
Yeah.
And so they did a lot of touring during this time, and kind of even more so integrated into the reggae scene. They had people like Nina Cherry coming and playing with them on the road. And that's like a really cool thing to think about, that they were integrating when punk was this sort of very boundaried genre where it was like all of these kind of men controlling it, or like you had to look a certain way or whatever. They had lots of other artists or lineups where they were like opening for reggae bands and things like that, still playing punk music. Mm-hmm. And so around this time too, kind of to go back to like the scene, a cool thing is that Punky Reggae Party, the song by Bob Marley, actually originally mentioned the Slits in the lyrics. I think it changed over time, but that song is kind of like a exemplary of like exactly what was going on during these years that we're talking about, because it was a lot of like the reggae clubs all the punks would hang out in, and then they'd play reggae at the punk clubs, and it was like this shared culture. And so it's cool that Bob Marley liked the Slits.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I saw the Slits in 2008 in Michigan, and our area just kept yelling, Punky Reggae, Punky Reggae. I love
that so much. And it's so cool. Like the crossovers, you know, like Police and Thieves, The Clash did. That's a reggae song that they did a cover of. And then they did a song called Lovers Rock, which is alluding to reggae and stuff. Yeah, so that's kind of like what was going on. And I think in the documentary they talked about Ari was such like a force. Like she would walk into these clubs, and like Bob Marley even met her and was just like, what is your thing? Like, what are you doing? And then like caught on that like it's a way to like bring reggae into this like form of like rock music.
Yeah, I think that Aria probably made a friend in everybody. She just was wild child, super in her own world, just like a free bird. So I can definitely see how other artists saw something really special in her. She wasn't trying to be anybody else.
Yeah, and that's like what Viv said, like seeing her live. Yeah, seeing her live, Viv was like, she's so iconoclastic, was like the quote. She was like, I never seen like as good of a front person since Johnny Rotten, and then I saw her and I thought she was better than any woman or guy I'd ever seen do that. And I was like, oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Like, that's so cool. But yeah, she even being the youngest member of the band had this like raging personality, which you can like hear in the lyrics. Just like some of the songs they sang were so like I guess like show-stopping, or sort of like made people take a second glance at the time, along with the name, which I think she was the one that came up with it. I'm pretty sure the Slits.
I'm pretty sure she did, because in an interview she was asked what it meant.
Yeah.
And she said it can mean three things.
Yeah.
It can mean violence, a slit in a skirt, and I think she says, we all know what that is.
That was kind of like along with their look and all that we were talking about. Her personality was like, to come up with that name was like, when you see that, it's, you know, along with a lot of the Buzzcocks and like Sex Pistols, it was like this very like pornographic, violent, like whatever, and then it was teen girls like playing it. But that was like kind of what you had to do, and I think a lot of women today, even, it has to be almost like a performative character thing to get people to like look past the fact that this is like three women in a band or whatever. So they were like, okay, we're gonna call ourselves the Slits and like shock and scare people, and then they won't be worried what we're doing.
Yeah,
like,
you're already initially shocked.
Yeah.
So
after that, like you're there, you're in it.
I remember like there was a magazine they were talking about that wouldn't even write. They had an article about the Slits, but they refused to put their name in the article.
Yeah. Oh, and that's one thing I forgot to talk about. Cut was the album cover.
Oh,
so yeah, I want to talk about that. So the album cover, which like if you're listening, you can Google it and look it up. You may have seen it. It basically has Ari, Tessa, and Viv. They wanted to do like a weird cover, so apparently when they were recording this, they went outside, and it's kind of in front of like a farm house sort of thing, and they were wearing just loincloths, and they ended up kind of like fighting around in the mud and getting mud all over each other, so they're like basically nude, covered in mud, their hair is all muddy, and they're just like kind of grimacing at the camera. And it was so like, they sort of had to do that because it was like the complete opposite of this like look of any one, like all of the women singers putting out these like records at the time with like the 70s like perfect look. They literally like rolled around in the mud and took a picture of it. And that like that's so powerful. Like
their bodies are basically fully exposed on that
literally.
cover, and it was a pretty controversial album cover.
Yeah, like there was, I think it was like a different magazine wouldn't put the picture in it, and like I couldn't like fact check it, but I read in one article that apparently someone claimed they like ran their car off the road because they saw a billboard of like their album, and I was like, that's so great, because it's like sort of forcing, I think, men at the time to just be comfortable with like or be uncomfortable, to be like, oh, does this make you uncomfortable that we're like, we have bodies and we're women and we're like doing this? And so they like put themselves right on the cover like that. And
where I see it is like, we're chicks, here we are, and deal with it. Now listen to the music.
Yeah, exactly.
We got all that out of the way, now listen to the music,
because there's no way to like divert sexuality completely, I think, especially in a genre like punk, because it's you know, like a lot of it does punk is childish in a way. It was made by teenagers at the time, and kind of a lot of the views are like anger or like a weird feeling or whatever, and theirs was like just a total rejection of not only norms, but like, we're not gonna let you like paint us as this like you know, like market us like sexually or whatever. And I've even read some interviews, I think with Viv and Tessa like recently, where they were like, we see, which is their view on this, you know, this is complicated, but like they see you know, artists now, and they were like, what we were doing was we just didn't want to like be fake or like just have like a look or whatever, so they did that, you know, which is of course a different type of marketing. But I think at the time it was so important to like do something like that, to have a album cover where they were nude and covered in mud.
Obviously they love to have a shock factor, their name and that album cover.
Exactly. It like totally contributed to what they were doing, and I think it is a good visual for the actual music on there, because they're talking about things like sexual assault or whatever, but it's like owning your body and being like a woman in punk, and saying all these things years before feminism was accepted and all that. So it's like, that album cover is pretty important. Pretty
it really
cool.
does. It really does connect with the music, definitely. And also it has that kind of tribal look to it, which is another element that they really have in their music. So it all fits together.
Yeah, for sure.
There's actually a lot of meaning to that cover.
Yeah, that's what they were going for. It was like the tribal thing, because they did incorporate world music and like intersect with all of these other artists. So it, like totally was this like natural, raw, like back to the basics sort of like thing, which is so interesting. Yeah. So they toured around, and then they put out the Untitled sort of retrospective, and in 1981 they signed to CBS Records and did Return of the Giant Slits. But this record is really, really interesting. I remember the first time I heard it, I just like, it's psychedelic, not in the sense that it's like psych rock, but it like truly, like, I felt like my brain expanded like when I listened to it.
Extremely experimental. Very experimental and
wild.
Darker, I would say.
I think it's much more darker tone, and like the album cover to this one is sort of like a painting of them, and lots of like dark, you know, red, blue, and black. But yeah, this, I think they further kind of made their journey into world music here, and they sort of expanded punk's boundaries for everyone in punk at this, like, by doing this record, even though it didn't sell a ton at the time or whatever. Like this, you can look at a lot of, I think, punk artists now and see how this like is influential, just like as far as setting a scene, or like being the first people to be like, okay, this like type of avant-garde, like world music, weird time measures and all of this in the music, like you can do that and it's still punk.
I would think that they weren't considered punk after that album, because it was such a contrast from what was going on. They kind of created their own genre.
They kind of did make their own genre, like and they sort of, I think, as dub had developed at the time too, like really incorporated that more, because there is like a bit of electronic like production and all that, and Yeah, there's so many good songs on this one, like Earth Beat.
I love Earth Beat.
It's the first one, but I think that's, like one of my favorite
I covered
Slits
that
songs.
when I was 14.
Oh, wow.
And
That's awesome.
I didn't know the lyrics at all, so I just made up my own lyrics. But it was that song.
That's amazing. I love that so much.
And also a song to listen to if you really want to understand how experimental that album is Face Place.
Yes, yeah. Face Place is a weird song.
It is. It is super
really
weird.
Yeah, I feel like Face Place and Animal Space / Spacier are like two of the most experimental on there.
But Ari Up's vocals just are so good.
They really are, and
good.
she definitely evolves as a vocalist. And what's interesting about her vocals is she has a German Jamaican accent. So she's already kind of going in with this really unique way of phrasing and pronouncing things. And here it's a bit more melodic, even though they aren't traditional melodies, I would say.
And lots of layering melodies as well.
Yeah, for sure. And it's really cool to see that they did grow as musicians and kind of become this unit of what the Slits are, even though they broke up soon after this.
Yeah. I think that they probably grew confident in just going in their own direction, because in the beginning they were kind of following the footsteps of where the scene was going in the beginning, and then they became more confident as they went on to really just grow into their own and not stick to that quote punk sound.
Yeah, for sure. Just no rules on this, which is once again how the best art is made. And it incorporates sounds from reggae, dub, and world music and all of that, but also lyrically, I think they kind of said most of what they wanted to say in the punk sense on the first one, where it was very straightforward lyrics and all of that. And this one is a lot more sort of poetic and subtle and really interesting. Earth Beat is sort of about the earth, and it's sort of psychedelic in that sense, and it's all kind of carries that theme of their relationship to the world and themselves, and it's very introspective and kind of not punk in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really, really wild. But yeah, Earth Beat, I think I would definitely just recommend listening to that song.
I think my mom still has a VHS of me playing that, actually. I need to find
it. That's amazing. You should put that on Instagram or something. That's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that record, there's just really a change there, but I think that record is just so important. After that record, however, they became confident in their sound and all of these things, but in 1982 they sort of decided to break up. So this band really only ran from officially 1977 to 1982, which is a very short time. There is a reunion we'll talk about, but during the breakup, it was kind of hard for them, and Ari she had twins soon after the band broke up, and kind of went to the jungles of Brazil and Jamaica, and then came back to the UK a bit. Tessa actually faced heroin addiction during this time, so it's kind of interesting. Just they were so kind of used to being a unit, I think, that it was hard for them to break up,
especially being so young, and that's all they knew.
Yeah, I mean, they became adults while they were in this band. So it's sort of an interesting thing. And then
Palmolive was saying transitioning out of punk was a withdrawal from a substance, Yeah. Such a going back to, the normal lifestyle.
Yeah,
probably really messed with them a little bit.
Different at the time too. It's now I can go to a punk show on a Tuesday and go to a country show on Wednesday and a DIY show the next day, and it's not weird. But then it was a whole different sector of society for them, the way they looked and all of that. So
and it really was a unit. I feel like. So.
Yeah, I think so. So it was so for years they kind of broke out of this, and a couple of them did normal things, but that they did break up. But a lot of these bands, they didn't, it was a very short term and so influential during that time. And in 1988, they released the John Peel Sessions, which is cool because they were recorded kind of before, I believe before, most of them, before their first album. And I always think that's cool. Like, a lot of the bands we've done on this podcast have Peel sessions, and it's just cool to see, like, what a band sounds like just playing live, like, from the beginning, and then you can kind of see the roots of, like, where they went after that.
Yeah, 3 of the songs on the Peel sessions are uncut. Love and Romance, Newtown, and Shoplifting.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great, I would definitely recommend listening to that. I would definitely go through the albums, but, like, the Peel sessions really give you an insight to, like, okay, like, they had some talent here, like, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
So after they broke up in about 2005, Tessa was in the UK and Ari came back and wanted to kind of get the band back together. So they did an EP called Revenge of the Killer Slits, and they had Paul Cook, who used to be in the Sex Pistols, and Marco Peroni, who used to be in Susie and the Banshees and Adam and the Ants, and then a couple of younger women. So they had Anna Schultz, Adele Wilson, and Holly Cook, who is Paul Cook's daughter, actually, kind of put together like a band, and they toured and things. And I think it was Tessa that eventually, was it Tessa or one of them eventually kind of left the reunion tour situation, I guess. I think it was Viv, actually. But they did do another album, Trapped Animal, in 2009, which is an interesting record.
I like it a lot. They did add in a lot of pop influences, and actually there is auto-tune at one point.
Yeah, it's like very different.
Some synth in there.
But it's crazy because it's so many, over 30 years later, I guess. But yeah, it is, it kind of does remind me of the parallels of like Bikini Kill, of where they were punk and then now Kathleen Hanna's in like a synth pop band sort of, and it's the same thing, but it's just, you know, as time goes on they have to change it and they're older, and
I feel like they're doing the same thing they've always done, which is shock factor.
Yeah, true. They were like, you know? Well, you expect this from us, now we're gonna do this.
Yeah, it's a really good album, but I feel like in Trapped Animal that they do add in a lot of feminist lyrics to that album. And in the first track, Ask Ma, there's this lyric in there that I love, and I believe it's men who need us to be their mother or who hate us 'cause of their mother.
Wow, yeah.
Pretty sassy.
I love that. That's amazing. I mean, it is cool to see that they were, I think, in their 40s at this point or whatever, but yeah, like, it was, I think, a little bit more, whereas then feminism also wasn't so accepted, so it was like what they were doing was feminist, but it was like here they definitely have more like concrete themes of that, of like, this is what we're singing about as like grown women now that have gone through life, you know. It's really interesting. I definitely haven't listened to this album as much as the others, but it's like pretty good for a, you know, 30 years later to make an album.
It's like, yeah, it's a great album.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it.
After 2009, so they were actually, so the documentary we were talking about, Here to Be Heard, they filmed quite a bit of it when this was happening. There's some footage from like Ari on the tour and all of this, but things were a little weird where some people left the band, the younger members, and Ari was kind of stressful and started kind of cutting the other members off, and unfortunately it turned out she was very like sick. She had cancer and didn't really tell anyone, and they knew something was up, and died shortly after in 2010.
Yeah, she didn't want to make it known, but she did take it out on other people, her frustration or her pain.
Yeah.
And people didn't know what she was so angry about.
Yeah, and tried to make it easier, I think, in a way of like, let me like distance it and then it won't be so hard. I think in a way that drove her to want to do the reunion in the first place. I'm not sure if she knew like in the very beginning in 2005 or whatever, but I think in a way she might have, or like when they were doing the touring, I think it was like she wanted to get as much done as she could, or prove to herself that she still could while she was able. So that's really sad, but I think it is cool that she at least got to do like one last album, since she felt so defined by like being a member of the Slits in her life. Was
I'm so glad they did that. insane to see them live.
Yeah, talk about that. What was it like?
It was
to
in
see
a
them
small
live?
club.
That's amazing.
Small, super small, dark club in Pontiac, Michigan, which is not a city you go to very often to see shows. And it was packed. It was packed in there, and Tessa was there, and Ari Up was just nuts on stage, and Viv was there, and it was just like amazing. I was totally blown away, so inspired. I was 18 when I got to see that show, and Ari Up was just nuts on stage. You would never imagine she was sick.
Yeah,
she was jumping around.
Her like presence, I can't imagine like being in the room. I feel like it would like be like electrifying.
Just she's so gigantic on stage, and really like connects with the crowd, talks to the crowd a lot. Is kind of silly on stage a little bit, you know. She's not so serious. She's just having a great time.
That's awesome.
And
I love
she really
that she still was like that later.
Yeah, you would have never imagined that there was anything going on.
Wow, that's awesome. And that's like you can see in the videos and stuff, just like her personality. Like it just seemed like so like you get why people kind of just watch this happen, or like even why people would be like guys in the scene would maybe be mad about her or something, because she was so like just enigmatic as like a person. That's amazing to get to see them live. Did they play mostly like the new record?
Yeah, they played
stuff?
a lot of the new stuff when I saw them, which I wasn't too familiar with. I knew Cut, you know, but it was a great show.
That's awesome.
And I'm so lucky to have seen them.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's really cool. So that is pretty much the history of the Slits, but is there anything else we want to like expand on or add?
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about Viv Albertine's autobiography.
Oh yeah. So Viv Albertine did write an autobiography. I have not read it, but Olivia has. So
yeah, it's called Close, 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 Music, 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 Boys, Boys, Boys.
I love that title.
And it's her autobiography, and it just speaks about her career before the Slits, during the Slits, and after the Slits. And I really loved reading about the beginning of her becoming a musician, and how there was a camaraderie between her and other punk musicians where they were really helping her out, you know, with her guitar, you know, tuning her guitar, you know, really like helping her out get to where she was.
Yeah, she bought her guitar for like 200 quid, which I'm not sure what that would be in American money, but I assume it was pretty cheap at the time. And she said Sid Vicious was like someone who would help her. I thought it was funny. I wish I had written down the exact quote, but she was talking about during that time when she was becoming a musician, how she was dating Mick Jones. He was like, he would never help me. All the other guys helped me. Like, they would teach me, which I thought was interesting. But yeah, she was like kind of in, like, one of the guys, like, made her way in and just like was doing this punk music at a very early time, which I think is really cool. I definitely want to check out that book. So after Cut, when Palmolive left, when she wasn't sure of the direction of the band, she actually ended up joining the Raincoats, which is like also another hugely influential punk band. That is it self-titled? I can't remember the name of that one record.
Palmolive played on the debut album in 1979 with the Raincoats.
Yeah, their self-titled debut. Yeah, she was on that, and I think that is like one of the most important like punk albums as well. There's a great 33 1/3 book written by Jim Pelly, who's a music journalist, on that, and it's like a great book, great album, like Fairy Tale in the Supermarket, all that. So it is cool to see that not only did the Slits influence so many bands around them at the time, as in just being a woman on stage, and sort of gave other women the power to do that because they did it and other women saw it, but they influenced, as music does happen anywhere when there's sort of a hub. I feel like each decade sort of has like different cities and there's like hubs of music or whatever, and so as happens, just influenced a lot of other bands to start and were members of other bands. So you wouldn't have the Raincoats if you hadn't had her starting out in the Slits and stuff like that. So I think that's really cool. Well, that is pretty much the history of the Slits, and you should definitely listen to Cut and Return of the Giant Slits and all of those things. Yeah, thank you for being on this episode.
Absolutely. This is a really, really cool thing that you're doing.
Thank you.
Bandsplainer. I love it.
It's very
exciting.
happy
to do this with you. Thank you.
Cool, and thank you for listening.